Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this third and final talk in our series of Romans talks as part of the UHI Perth Museum season of talks that we started a couple of years ago now. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome David Breeze, who not only ran the archaeological functions of Historic Scotland, as it was today, Historic Environment Scotland, but remains one of Scotland's foremost scholars on the Roman presence, not just in Scotland, but in Britain and in Europe. And he's going to talk to us today about Roman frontiers. Just before I hand over to David, the usual applies. If you have questions, by all means, put them in the chat as the talk goes, when they're fresh in your mind. And then at the end of it, Alex and I will field those questions to David. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Just checking, can we all see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction and for the support of Dougie and Alex in this. If we were to look at what I call a political map of the Roman Empire, showing provinces, it's a bit bland, isn't it? You can see the extent of the empire, position of legionary fortresses, provincial boundaries. But once you add relief to that, you have altogether a different picture. You have some indication of why the frontiers of the empire were where they were. Although the red obscures rivers, rivers play a great part in the discussion that's going to come, and of course to mountains, as you can see in modern Romania here, or in North Africa, in this area, and of course then we have the desert to the south. So relief is really very helpful to us in understanding the landscapes in which Roman frontiers sat. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Hadrian's Wall in its landscape. This is the most famous section of the wall, the iconic view through the 19th century. The tea towel I'm using at the moment, actually, believe it or not, has this view of Hadrian's Wall on it. However, that's just part of the wall. That's the craggy bit in the center, the scenic bit. Elsewhere, it's not quite so spectacular setting in its landscape. We also have here on the Antonine Wall, we're looking eastwards from above Croy Hill, right at the very top, there's an arrow where the wall comes across fairly low ground and then rises up onto the craggy sector and runs along it. To the left, incidentally, a lot of pit heaps. So here we're looking actually at two separate landscapes, lowland landscape and something approaching a highland landscape, if you like, more mountainous, rugged, let's say. If we were to just swim around and look at the position of the wall in the landscape, we're looking across the central valley of Scotland, the Midland Valley, which is also a rift valley, to the Campsie Fells and the Kilpatrick Hills beyond. And the wall is actually sitting on the very northern slopes before the ground drops down into this broad, still very wet valley before rising up to the hills beyond. So the position of the Antonine Wall in its landscape is very significant and indeed very obvious to any visitor today. That was a view from somewhere around the center of the wall here, looking northwestwards. This view I always like because it shows what you can see, what landscape, what land you can see from the Antonine Wall. You've not got so much of a view to the south because the hills are rising up behind you, but to the north, the darker the colouring, the more you can see that particular point from positions along the wall. So right in the center of the Campsie Fells, here you can obviously see this from very many places, but over in the east, you get very wide views, even though not so from so many places along the wall. So it just gives us an entree, if you like, to understanding our Roman frontier in its landscape setting. So coming back to this map, which you'll see quite a few times, it's incidentally, I think, the best map you'll ever see of the Roman Empire. It's available online, which will give you the directions at the end. And what I want to do is to start looking at different landscapes through which the Roman frontiers ran. And the Romans themselves understood the importance of the setting of their empire. So Tacitus, writing a little after 100 AD, said, the empire's frontiers are on the oceans or distant rivers. Some contemporary writers name the rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and of course the oceans, which we're now going to see a picture of. This is looking at Scarborough Head. You can see sticking up the medieval castle, but on the flat headland to its left, there are remains visible of a late 4th century Roman fortlet and a tower, presumably a watchtower. And this is right on the edge of the ocean. This was the very boundary of the Roman Empire. And the Romans thought this was pretty safe, of course. They'd reached the Channel, La Manche, they'd reached the Irish Sea, they'd reached the North Sea, which of course used to be called the German Ocean. And they were pretty safe until the late 3rd century. And in the 280s, we first hear of invaders coming round from Jutland and North Germany and attacking mainly at first the northwest coast of France and modern Low Countries. So we have a series of forts, which you can see on the map, placed along the southern coast of the Channel in order to protect what is now the Low Countries, Normandy, and so on down to Brest in modern Brittany. And others were built along the east coast of England. And as the pressure intensified from Ireland, we have late forts built at modern Cardiff and Carnarvon and Lancaster, elsewhere along the west coast of Britain. So at first, the oceans kept the empire defined and safe, but they, as we know in later times in particular, became became a passageway for invaders. Elsewhere, the rivers, as Tacitus remarked, were singly important in marking the end of the Roman Empire. This is a Danube gorge in modern Austria. It's interesting here, you can travel through this area, you see how the forests come down these steep slopes to the river. And we know of very, very few military installations along this part of the river, but simply because there wasn't really any necessity for them, because the steep slopes rendered this very difficult to cross by an invading force. Further down, it's rather a different matter as we come to the flatlands of the Danube Delta in modern Romania. This is Capodava, an enormous late Roman fort. You can get an idea of the scale of it if you look at the people down here or on top, standing on top. It's an enormous fort in this great open flatland at the eastern end of the Danube. As we swing round the northern half of the Roman Empire, the Euphrates from southern Turkey well into Syria acted as the frontier. And this was taken on my visit in 1987, where you can see the river slowly filling up with water behind the Ataturk dams. But you still get a very good idea of the very steep slopes down to the river, which is why where there were passes which allowed access across the river, there was a Roman legionary fortress placed. So this is the boundary. We can see the Euphrates from the very top coming down and then leaving the empire, as it were, and swinging eastwards into modern Iraq and the Gulf. But here at these crossing points, such as Zugma and Samosata, where the roads, as you can see, cross the frontier, there were legionary fortresses placed at possible entry points for invaders. Another entirely different landscape, in which in many ways governed the location of the frontier in the southern half, was the desert. This is the desert landscape between the Red Sea and the River Nile. Shipping bringing luxury goods to Rome sailed up the Red Sea as far as they could, but the winds were against them. So they offloaded their goods, which traveled across the land to the Nile, especially to Koptos, which still exists. This route was guarded against local tribesmen by outposts such as this. At Koptos, incidentally, there is an inscription which tells you how much the charges were that were levied for travelers. So it's something like 2 drachmae for a wife of a soldier, but it's 100 drachmae you were charged if you were a prostitute. Further south, we have a really interesting section. This is southern Syria. Bosta is just in the border, across the border in Syria. Amman is here, capital of Jordan, and the frontier runs down to Aqaba on this arm of the Red Sea. But notice this kink. Why ever do we have a kink here? Azraq, incidentally, is where T. E. Lawrence had his headquarters in the First World War, if you're interested in that period. Why do we have this kink? Well, it reflects the 250 millimeter ISO height. This is the kink, just out from Amman, coming up to Damascus, and this defines, this is the Fertile Crescent, which we learned about at school, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. But this line is the limit east of the Mediterranean, which agricultural cultivation is possible. So I'll just go back to that. There's the bump swinging round, which reflects this the 250 millimeter height, and therefore defines the frontier for us. Of course, what you do get in deserts, nevertheless, are oases. And these are important points for the Roman army to control. Here's one in the Syrian desert, and its oasis behind. Here's a Roman fort, could be any date over 2, 3, even probably 4 centuries. Very typical of both civilian and military architecture of the time, but it's placed beside the oasis. Gazibashir, for example, however, in the Jordanian desert, further south, here there's no water, no oasis at all. This is probably the best surviving Roman fort in the whole Roman Empire. It's a square with towers at the corner, as you can see, 3 stories high, with the stairs certainly in these still in existence, so you can climb to the top. These are not gargoyles at the top. These are people who have come up the stairs. And inside it are the mangers for horses or camels, and also accommodation for the soldiers. And where did the horses and the soldiers get their water? In a specially dug cistern just a few meters away, which is still in use by the Bedouin for feeding, watering their camels. Of course, there are different kinds of deserts. This is another fortlet in the Egyptian desert, against, as you can see, an incredibly sharp, bleak, mountainous landscape. And it's mountains I want to turn to. So the Carpathian Mountains encircle the heartland of modern Transylvania in modern Romania. And along the watershed between these mountains, you're looking at it in front of us, a fairly low one in this case, we have a series of watchtowers which protected the line of the frontier and the province behind from would-be invaders. So here, right at the very top of the screen, for example, is a cluster of forts and towers which protect a very wide gap in the hills. But here we have what we assume was the boundary of the province, but a lot of the forts are pulled back, placed in the river valleys where they could move in different directions to repel any attack on the frontier. And the watershed itself is often left with just a series of watchtowers along it. Other mountains were really very substantial again. These are the Atlas Mountains, viewed in modern Morocco. This is northeastern Morocco, inland from modern Marrakesh. And you can see these mountains are really quite spectacular and were not occupied by Rome. In fact, the military deployment in northern modern Morocco is quite different from anywhere else. The forts are all inland on the coastal plain. And when we move along a little to the east from the Atlas, where we were looking at a moment ago is just off to the west of this slide. And the forts pick up here and really run along the edge of the Atlas Mountains here and the high plains beyond. And when the Emperor Septimius Severus, who tried to conquer Scotland in the early 3rd century, also moved the frontier forward here in North Africa. He actually came from North Africa. He pushed them up into the foothills of the Atlas here. But rather than cross the high plains, his boundaries actually circle around the edge of them, giving you quite a strange disposition of Roman fortifications. He came, Septimius Severus, from Leptis Magna, one of these chain of coastal towns, and he also pushed forts out for protection into the oases in the northern Sahara, such as Ghadames and Bunjem, which is this site, where we have an outpost at an oasis in the Sahara with this was taken before the French excavations in the 1970s and 80s and onwards, where they found an awful lot of very useful inscriptions. But here's one of the gates, which still stands up to the beginning of the arch and part of the columns of the headquarters building inside, well into the Sahara, but guarding a route, as you can see. Each of these main routes from the south have on it a Roman fort. One of the strangest frontiers is this, which faces two ways. This is along the eastern edge of the Black Sea. And from Trabzon, modern Trabzon, along the edge here of the Black Sea, we have these forts, often associated with civilian settlements outside them, which circle round the edge of the Black Sea. Many of them are interestingly placed. Look how they're close to the mouths of rivers. That's because it's very useful to pull your ships into the tributaries flowing into the Black Sea or a river and taking them out of the flow of water in the river or the sea. Very common phenomenon. It's the same in Scotland if you think of Inveresk at the mouth of the Esk on the southern shore of the Forth, or Cramond at the mouth of the Armand a little further to the west. Same principle. Anyway, here what we have are forts which face out to sea and also face to the friendly kings in land, such as those in what is now Georgia, here, Colchis of old, where the fabled Golden Fleece was supposedly found. Why do we have these forts along the coast? It's very simple. The Black Sea could be, if Rome relaxed, a home for pirates. We can see on 2 or 3 occasions when Rome's eyes were focused elsewhere on troubles on the eastern frontier, for example. What happened then was a resurgence of piracy in the Black Sea. So these forts were the bases of fleets of ships to keep a control of piracy, as well as maintaining relations with the friendly kings and keeping their eyes open on the passes through the Caucasus Mountains, which are to the very top right-hand side of this slide. But what happens when there were no mountains, no rivers, no deserts, no seas? Well, the Romans under Hadrian, and a little before, in fact, started building what we might call artificial frontiers or land frontiers. So here, there are actually 2 in Germany. This leaves the Rhine just upriver from Remagen, scene of the fame of the last bridge over the Rhine in 1944. And it runs around the Taunus Mountains and down this line. And then under Antoninus Pius, the end of his reign, the emperor whose troops conquered southern Scotland in the early 140s, the frontier was pushed out a little bit to this line here, which is dead straight for 80 kilometers. So the rivers are left behind, in fact. As you can see, this is the Rhine and this is the Danube. And the frontier is pulled forward from those rivers. And in Germany, it can still be seen, running across the landscape like this, a straight line, but very little of that to see on the ground, which is why quite a lot of the what we see today are reconstructions of towers or fortlets, or in this case, the palisade itself. This barrier was simply a very strong fence and not a stone wall until the fence needed to be replaced, and then it was either rebuilt as a stone wall or as an earthen bank. So that's the range of types of frontiers. Let's look at some aspects in greater depth. Were these frontiers ever attacked? How did the Romans relate to that? I do like this picture. It's obviously related to activities in Scotland, because here we have a depiction of the Desford Carnix, now in the National Museum. So controlling invasion routes was very important to the Romans, as you can imagine. And when we look at the 3rd century disposition of troops on Hadrian's Wall, we can see this very clearly. The big beasts, the legions, 5,000 men, are further south in York, or even further south at Chester. The mobile units, the cavalry units, are actually on the wall at Stanwick, at Carlisle, or on the roads leading south, with even more backup beyond. And on the east side of the country, one on each side of the road, modern A68, Deer Street leading north, and another 3 clustering fairly close behind. This cannot be sheer happenstance. The Romans have thought where they want to have their military strength, and especially their mobile units, and they are focused on these points in and out of the province. Potential invasion routes towards the province, but potential invasion routes outside. And we see this in particular in Germany. This is the frontier running from modern Rhine Delta in the Netherlands, along the Rhine, and then the line we've just seen running right the way around to modern Regensburg. And what is interesting here is the disposition of troops. So at Vetera, at Xanten, which is just over the border from the Netherlands in Germany, we have a legion, and it's flanked on each side here and down here by cavalry units. So for a long time, after Augustus had lost his 3 legions in Germany, a long time after that, the Romans thought that they would move back and reconquer Germany. Tacitus, writing, as I said, shortly after 100 AD, said, the conquest of Germany is taking a long time, not realizing, or perhaps realizing and making it almost a joke of it, ironic comment, let's say, without realizing that, in fact, it had long since stopped being feasible. But this route up the Lippe is a really important one, here, and reflected by the disposition of a legion and backup auxiliary cavalry regiments. A little upstream, we have Mainz, where there was a legion. They didn't bother moving that up to the frontier, but they placed the strongest auxiliary unit they could at this point, with unusually a backup unit behind. Most of the time, all these units are actually on the frontier line, but here we've got 2 very strong units right on a route up the Main and into Germany. So routes, very important when it comes to military deployment. Of course, it's interesting looking at this in a different way. This is modern Austria to the south, Vienna, Carnuntum towards the east end of Austria, and Brigatio in Hungary, the great legionary fortresses clustered close together and telling us something important, that there is pressure on this frontier. But interestingly, the pressure wasn't just from invasion. This is Carnuntum in the middle one of these 3. And this is the end, the southern end of the amber route, which started out on the Baltic and brought amber and other goods down from what's now northern Germany. And you can see how Roman goods flocked up these river valleys, in particular the March Valley in the center, but otherwise, and in particular leading up from the 2 most easterly legionary fortresses, as you can see. So what I find interesting when I'm looking at a map of the Roman Empire and thinking about Tacitus's comment about our empire stretches to the oceans and to the faraway rivers. Yes, of course it did. The whole of the western coast, in particular, faced the Atlantic. They knew of nothing beyond. We have the Rhine, and then to the east, the Danube, right the way down to the delta, and in the east, from somewhere around southern Turkey, we have the Euphrates. And then to the south, we have the desert, as we've seen, and in modern Algeria, of course, the Atlas Mountains. Now, what becomes interesting about these rivers is that they're not just very clear demarcation lines. The Romans used them as demarcation lines. We have quite a few references to this, to people living beyond the frontier near Vetera, here, modern Cologne, complaining that they could only come into the empire unarmed at certain points and travel under military escort. More interesting, for the Danube area around here, we have 4 treaties from the late 170s, all relating to the river, stating that the tribes beyond the river had to keep 10 stades away. Then when clearly they couldn't control that, the Romans couldn't enforce that, 5 stades away, and then finally the Romans, as it were, shrugged their shoulders and said, okay, you can come up to the river, but you've got not allowed on the islands of the river. So they recognize the importance of the rivers as frontiers, but they're also important as communication routes. The rivers provided lines of supply. These are tents being loaded on board a ship on the Danube. I think it's highly likely that, as much as anything, the Roman Empire's northern frontier fossilized primarily on the Rhine and the Danube for the sheer convenience that having their legionary fortresses along the rivers enabled the easy supply of goods and indeed the movement of armies up and down these rivers. Rivers were so important in that way in the northern frontier of the empire. So coming back to the boundaries, when we look at the northern frontier of the empire, the whole north, right the way down to modern Syria and where the Euphrates leaves the empire, the provincial boundaries, the boundaries of the empire itself, were governed by water, the existence of water. The rivers, the seas, they defined why the empire stopped where it did. In the south, right the way through from the Euphrates, through southern Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, the boundary is defined by the lack of water. And we can't escape that. Now, coming back to the very first map we looked at, it was what I call a political map. It was flat. It was just the provincial boundaries and the legionary bases. It lacked the relief which this map shows us. But each of these maps also has a problem, insofar as it implies that this was the edge of Rome. This was the edge of Roman activity. The Romans didn't go beyond that. And of course, it's very far from the truth. This map shows us what we might call the reach of Rome. They reach the northernmost tip of Jutland. They reached the Orkney Isles and probably, according to Tacitus, sighted Shetland. It's a very difficult one, this. You've got to get quite close to Shetland to see it. And when I used to sail there regularly, when I was working for Historic Scotland, one time I went up onto the bridge and asked the captain if you could see Orkney, you could see Shetland from Orkney, and the answer was no. You've got to get quite a way up there. So I'm not absolutely certain that they saw Shetland, to be honest. But we do know that here, the Roman army reached the Elbe and actually crossed it and erected an altar on the other side. Trenčín, which is in the Eastern Carpathians, in the middle of this map, there's an inscription on a rock, which basically says, we was here by the Romans. And right down at Garama, the southern part of this map, there's another inscription on a rock surface there, which is the name of a legionary centurion, Aurelius, who got there. They crossed the Atlas Mountains into the Sahara Desert. They sailed right the way down the Red Sea as far as modern Yemen. Nero sent an expedition up the Rhine, sorry, what am I talking about? The Nile, up into modern Sudan. And Roman armies reached the Caspian Sea and again left an inscription on a rock saying, Kilroy was here. So we have to be careful that maps don't make us blink it. We have to use, think in terms of a wider, holistic view of the activities of the Romans, in particular, of course, of our armies, because mainly the records are of military activity, but certainly civilians, merchants, went well beyond the empire. And we know a lot about the interior of Ireland. And we know the reason for this, which place names that is, and tribal names in Ireland, because Tacitus said our merchants went there. So we have both civilians and military forces exploring the world beyond the empire. Well, that's me. Here's a shameless plug at the end. If you want to know more, this is my book on the frontiers of Imperial Rome, now in paperback, available for all good booksellers, as they say. And I'll leave this on for a little longer because bottom left is Limes Österreich.at is a website. If you go on that, it's in English as well as German, and you can find there links to brochures, as they call it, booklets about the Roman frontiers, which are now have been passed over to Archeo Press, who will be publishing the first new book on Egypt shortly. And also you'll find copies of the maps, which I've just been looking at. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, David, for that splendid tour around the frontiers of the Roman Empire. It made me, especially, I never really, for some reason, it never quite gelled in my head, the thing about rivers and oceans, and it's obvious when you think about it. We're waiting for some questions to come in, and while we wait, that will allow me to ask a question about that. I mean, the frontiers in Britain specifically, I'm certainly used to thinking about, you know, the location of those, whether it's Hadrian's Wall or the Antonine Wall, because they represent these short kind of distances from one side to the other. Yeah. But actually, maybe we should reconceptualize that and think about the river estuaries that are either end of it. Those were kind of really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. They're obviously the Antonine Wall is on the southern shore of the Firth of Forth and the southern shore of the Firth of Clyde. But Hadrian's Wall is on the southern shore of the Solway estuary, but at the eastern end, it runs along the north shore of the Tyne. So actually, come to think of it, what am I talking about? The north end of the west end of the Antonine Wall runs along the north shore of the Clyde as well. So you do have this sort of strange relationship to the rivers on each side.
Which is obviously was presumably quite important, like you showed for the Danube, for resourcing those frontiers, for if nothing else. I mean, lots of Roman ships would have come into those points, I guess.
Yeah. And we have to be careful not to have glib answers to questions. Nick Hyam, who you will know, Mark, many years ago, pointed out that if you looked at if you relate the Roman forts in the north of England to good farming land, nearly every one is within an area of good farmland because soldiers needed food.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess my other question, because we're getting lots of thanks and delight at the talk, but few questions as yet. That view from the Antonine Wall, how much forest would they have looked out on from that view? Because I'm kind of, I guess I'm raising the hoary old question of the forest of Caledon and how much of that actually was there by the time the Romans came here.
Yeah. Well, Richard Tipping's work suggests that by about 500 BC, tree cover was about the same as today.
Yeah.
And in fact, in excavations of Roman forts in Scotland, a lot of the wood being used is not first-class wood.
Yeah.
It's more like alder and so on, willow. So that tells us something. And of course, the earliest recorded cereal cultivation in Scotland, which is actually up in Aberdeenshire, is something like 3,800 BC. So twice as long as back as the Romans are from us, twice the time before that, the land was being cultivated for cereals. So I think when we look at the Antonine Walls landscape today, we're looking at something which is not that dissimilar from 2,000 years ago, with lots of small farms and indeed probably fields. I mean, Lawrence Keppie at Bar Hill found cut hawthorn branches, which are as if they'd come from perhaps hedges in fields. Yeah. So and we've got field systems anyway of that period next to the Antonine Wall, but we simply don't know enough about the Iron Age at that time. So we have a problem there. What we can say utterly clearly is that it was a pretty fair open landscape. And if you look at the size of some of the marching camps, which cover 130 and 160 acres,
yeah,
you need a lot of cleared land for that. They just plonk them down on the farmland.
Yeah.
I have a question, Mark, if you don't mind.
Alex, fire away.
Yeah. No, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I thought that was a fabulous talk. So thank you. And clearly this is a strategy that they had developed. And I was just wondering if you can see how many it changes over time, or did they reconsider strategies over time, or can you see any particular patterns there?
Yes, I mean, time is interesting. One of the interesting aspects of life even today relates to military deployment. Why does Carlisle still have an occupied castle? Because it was once a border defensive town for England against Scots invasions. But here we are, 500 years on, and this sort of fossilization is still there of military deployment across England. It would be very interesting to look at where modern military bases are in relationship to the past. So first of all, there are two basic issues in relationship to fossilization. Once you've got your infrastructure in place, it's a hell of a job to change it. So Roman forts, legionary fortresses in particular, tended to be put in one place and just stay there. And so York, Chester and Caerleon were legionary bases for over 200 years. Earlier, legions were just moved around as necessary. The Romans, incidentally, wouldn't pay anything for the camp followers. They just had to shift for themselves. which is one reason why presumably Roman soldiers technically weren't allowed to marry. But the army was, the state was very clever. It recognized the marriage after retirement. But that's another story. I'm sorry. Once the legions used to move around, and then they got settled. And so what happened is that they moved parts of legions around. The last legion we know as a complete legion moved in the 160s. After that, no legion moved, a complete legion. And this created a problem when the new threats arose. So from the 3rd century, 235 onwards, the frontiers came under a lot of pressure. And it was difficult to create an army because troops had got settled into their bases. So what happened was sort of temporary mobile armies were created. And this, at the end of the century, under Diocletian, itself became institutionalized. So each emperor had his own mobile force. So he could move around the empire with his own army ready there and get on with the job. And that's an interesting aspect of the issues. You have, if you like, human nature operating in that way. The other aspect in relationship is, if you like, new forts had to be created in places where they hadn't been before because the threats came from different directions. And new types of fortifications were introduced, which tended to have higher walls to protect the soldiers inside. There's an absolutely wonderful quote from Tacitus describing a major revolt in the late 60s on the Rhine. And the site Vetera, which was on the mine map, had actually 2 legions in it. And the revolt was so bad it was attacked and overwhelmed and sacked. And Tacitus said, oh, the defenses here actually weren't very strong because we never expected anybody would have the gall to attack us. It's a wonderful comment about Roman army chutzpah, if you like.
Yeah.
And of course, once that started disappearing, once people realized they could attack the Roman armies and win, the Romans went in for smaller and therefore more easily defended fortifications and generally had higher walls to them, such as you see today on the Saxon shore.
We have a 2-part question from Sandra R, who asks what the total length of the frontier was and also how many people would have manned it at any one time.
What a question.
Yeah.
My best guess, which is in now getting into most of the textbooks, is 7,500 kilometers. But if you ask a geographer, he or she will tell you it depends how you measure. So, you know, if you take a river and you take a scale map where, you know, the whole of the Rhine is on one page of A4, it'll give you a very different measurement. And if you get out your tourist maps for the area and lay them out on the floor with and get a piece of string out and weave it round all the loops in the river. So I've done that. And my guess is about 7,500. I don't think I've ever done an estimate of how many soldiers. I mean, we know how many soldiers roughly there were in the Roman army. We can add it up. I'm sorry I haven't done it. I've done it for Britain. I can tell you how many there were on Hadrian's Wall and the like, but I don't carry the figures in my head. You'll just have to buy the book, Susan. But it is an interesting question. It enters into another interesting discussion, which is about manpower. Where the Roman army recruited from is interesting. as Italy became more civilized, I mean, in the late Republic, against Hannibal, a Roman army of thousands of men could be slaughtered, and the Roman state had so many people, how so strong, such a military idea that they created new armies. But the Italians gradually didn't want to join the army, and then the people of luxurious southern France didn't want to join the army. So increasingly, the army came from round the frontiers. And increasingly, there wasn't the manpower. I think that one reason why we have Hadrian constructing all these frontiers and giving up Trajan's conquest in the east and sometimes in Romania is because he realized that manpower is becoming a problem. Mm. You know, if you're going to conquer the world, you need a lot of soldiers because a lot of them will die. And Trajan lost enormous troops trying to conquer modern Iraq. And so I think there is a perception that there's a manpower shortage. And I don't think anybody's done any really serious work on this. I've trailed my coat to people who know the literary sources better, that this will be a good subject for somebody. So I hope I've answered the question.
Yeah, and set off a new area of research there. I think that's jolly interesting. That seems to be the end of the questions as we currently have them. So I guess
there's something to start up there, Mark.
oh, there we go. Yeah, were the Derek Yo asked, were the legionaries paid from the imperial coppers? Was this from regional mints? And was the hang on, I'm missing the rest of it for some reason. Oh, wait a minute. Oh.
Yeah, I think there's only half a question. Maybe there's more coming, but at least there's one question there. That
well, I'll try to.
I was asking whether the acceptance, especially when you said in the fossilized areas of the border, were the imperial mint or the coins accepted around that area. I was thinking such a vast area of them all being paid, and obviously the use of coinage. That's why I'm curious about how they were paid and how was the money used. Sorry.
Yeah, we know quite a lot about payment. The Romans were paid. Well, the Romans were paid in coins. There would taxation was paid in each province. So we can imagine that. I mean, Tacitus tells us something about this in the Agricola. The individual cities that made up the empire. I mean, if you think of St. Paul, he was not just a Roman citizen, he was a citizen of a no mean city called Tarsus. So the empire was technically a series of self-governing cities, though of course, in reality, it wasn't like that. But each of these self-governing cities raised their own taxation. And some of this went to the imperial provincial officials in London, say, in our case. And the soldiers were paid in coins. And we know this very clearly from anecdotes. So in 86, I think it was, the governor of Germany raised a rebellion against the emperor, and he funded this from the soldiers' savings in the legionary fortress. And it was a double legionary fortress. The invasion failed, and at that point it was stated that there would never be any double legionary fortresses again. That was 10,000 men, too much together, so they were split up, partly because of the fact that there was so much money in one place. So we know they were paid in coins, and we know that there were sometimes not special coins issued, but more coins issued to pay the troops. So in 86 in Scotland, we have coins coming in, especially at that time. We don't have many from the previous years because they weren't minting them. So suddenly they mint more because they needed to, presumably. So, and we have the documentation which shows that there were 4 paydays a year. The army soldiers in each unit would be paraded for the pay parade, and the money that they were given was recorded by each of the, as it happens, for each century in that unit, and from this tally was taken off money for Christmas din-dins, i.e. Saturnalia, for bedding, for various items like this. So there was 4 or 5 or 6 items which were deducted as off their pay. And at the end of this, if the soldier died in service, the money would go to his nearest heir or whoever is specified in his will, or he got it out of the camp bank and went off with it. By the time we move forward, what we find happening is that there is more payment in kind. And this was more open to abuse, it would appear. And the reason why we have anecdotes now is because of the abuse of the system, where soldiers were kept on the payroll even though they were dead, so that the rations would come in and would be taken off by the commanding officer. So this creates a bit more of a problem when we're dealing with the late empire as to the payment issues, because we don't see it in the form of coins. And we do see it also in the form of, if there was a military victory or the new emperor came in, he gave what's called a donative, we still use the same word, to his soldiers in silver. And I'd really like to know whether it was actually paid in real silver or whether it was just as a nominal sum added onto their pay record, because it would be an awful lot of silver otherwise. Yeah. Anyway, hope that's helpful.
That's very helpful, Davey. Thank you. I don't see any more questions. Do you, Alex?
No, I don't.
Okay. I think then all that remains is for me to thank on everyone's behalf, David, again. It's sad that we can't clap, I always think. You just can't hear it. It's a valuable noise when we're actually all gathered together. It's one of the things I'm looking forward to hearing again at some point. But I know that clapping is out there, David, for what was a delightful and stimulating talk. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
And the talk, like the other two, will appear online on CPK's website, so people can listen to it again if they want to. And we'll give the boost when our Roman exhibitions open in the autumn.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.